Okay, so just moving on to, we're going to cover, I do have a question. I mean, you brought it up. So just thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act. Both of you, just broadly, is this going to level the playing field? To some degree, I see it as America is reducing the cost. Like, whereas in Chile, they're putting on royalties to raise SQM's cost. Here, America's lowering potentially the cost of producers and developers. But broadly, thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act for lithium?
For lithium, I don't think it makes much difference, honestly. I do think it makes a huge difference on the side where you get the kilowatt hour credit and there is no criteria on where the material comes from. I mean, that's huge for a Tesla. That's huge for anybody that is producing packs, cells and packs in the US or quote unquote a friendly country. I would love to think it's going to help lithium a bunch, but let's just see if any projects can get permitted in the United States. And then you can say, okay, Canada's fair game. And yeah, Jigger can loan money in Canada, and let's see what happens.
I'm not sure that American taxpayer funds on the loans could go to Canada. I think the Department of Defense, that there are some grants that might work. The loans are one thing. They are loans. They're not grants. There's just, but it's the investment tax credits that matter, right? This 45X and 48C, 30% on the CapEx reduction and then 10% on the overall OpEx. That's really the leveling of the playing field that I'm talking about, because that's free money through the IRS code.
And those are direct payments. So even if you don't have a tax liability, you still get the money. So that should be positive. I guess if you can get permitted, then the loans should help and those tax credits should help. I guess there's one other balancing act, Joe. I'll be interested to hear your view. Is in order to get the EV tax credit, you need a percentage of the raw materials. So the question is, will this translate into OEMs just saying, no, well, I want production, all of your production from the US, or will there be a bit of a perk? Will there be an offset given that the final buyer will get a 7,500 credit because of local raw material?
I mean, we already talked about the GM Livent thing, and I mean, I just don't think there's enough to go around in the near term to make a big difference. But the other thing I think that people are ignoring is there's an election in November, and then there's an election in 24. And depending on how it goes, I don't necessarily think the Inflation Reduction Act holds up, because we're in a political environment where I think that to a large extent, supporting green energy is political, and it's unfortunate, but I'm not sure the Inflation Reduction Act survives 2024. Well, it would be January of 2025. But
yeah, I don't think the upcoming elections this year will change. That's now law. So I don't think, even if the House or Senate changes, that they're going to rip that up. And a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act was a geopolitical security of supply thing, not a green energy thing. And there's bipartisan support on localized supply.
I would disagree with you on that. I think when they say things are bipartisan, bipartisanship doesn't last very long in the United States in these times. I would disagree with the fact that you say it's now law. Well, look at some of our other laws that happened from 2016 on. And until we have a desire to be nonpartisan, and there's a lot of people in this country that still aren't behind the way the oil industry's been treated, and thinking that all oil is bad. And I think a backlash is possible, and I think we'll see what happens with inflation. but the Inflation Reduction Act's not going to reduce inflation.
It's a poorly named bill. I agree with that.
Well, that's why I mean, we can just disagree on that, which is fine. I'm not saying it's going to be canceled or anything, but I'm just saying I think there's so many things that are unclear that it's really hard to say it's certainly not going to hurt lithium investments. That's for sure. But how much of a help it is, yeah, I think Rodney's right. I think if you're going to get the tax credits like they did with the oil industry decades ago, where you got to depreciate things in 2 years instead of 16 or whatever it was, depending on what type of capital good it was. Yeah, that's good. That's gonna have a positive effect, but you have to have permitted projects. I mean, let's talk about, in the best case scenario, everything that's viable gets permitted. The U.S. is still at a huge deficit to the coming demand, because you can build cathode plants a lot faster than you can build lithium projects.
That's true, and I don't think United States self-sufficiency in lithium is realistic. But if you throw in Canada into the mix, then you're getting close. But you don't have to have 100%. But I believe, in a similar way that we had somewhat oil energy independence over 10 years through fracking and horizontal drilling and all of that, you had major investments in that for a long period of time. If you had that same type of investment in lithium in America and in Canada, and I think Canada to some degree might follow US, you may have this lowest common denominator, right? They don't want their projects to lose out. So I'm looking forward to see if there's tax policy and benefits in Canada as well. But if you look at both of those, we could have a huge boom of investment in both countries and get to maybe 60 or 70%, self-sufficiency. I don't know, maybe that's too high. 1 million tons out of a 3 million ton market by 2030, like as a big, hairy, audacious goal. I've put that out there as an idea between Canada and the US. The question here, do you see a risk of demand destruction based on the high lithium prices you're forecasting? Both of you.
I do not. Let's just go again, memory lane. 2016, price didn't jump over 30. It got near 30. A couple of transactions might have been over 30,000 a ton. Everybody was saying, oh, this will kill the battery market. And nobody did the math on what the percent, especially in a high nickel cathode, what the percentage of lithium cost was in those products. And yeah, it wasn't high for that long, but that didn't destroy demand. It's not destroying demand right now. And what's Tesla's backlog now versus when price was 10,000 a ton? I think there's some people that won't buy. I think the bigger issue is China has the democratized EV market because there's an offering for everybody. You can get a $4,500 Wuling, or you can buy a big Tesla or any of the new Chinese players. We don't have that. I think the more important issue is, what's the government going to try to do to make sure the EVs aren't just for rich guys? Because as long as there's a lithium shortage, there's going to be a bias to make the high-end vehicles. And I don't care what anybody says, Mary Barra can't come up with a high nickel platform where she can sell a car for $25,000 and make money.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's a key point, Joe. But I mean that's kind of been the angle for EVs from the start, is the easy pickings with the high end,
yeah,
where the margins were, and the all-in cost of running the vehicle is also something important. I guess that'll be what is it cost to charge and run, and those that relative to oil, but. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the number of EVs on offer, that's exploding. I guess the biggest issue is, can the OEMs make enough of a living to keep this going? Because they're the ones who are going to take the squeeze, I think, to be competitive and to price it, unless, even with the credits, we'll see if they can hold the price. I mean, the Cybertruck has just gone dark. I don't hear anything. I don't know where that's going to be priced now. There's certainly not going to be a single motor $40,000 model anymore. And the limit, if I remember in the IRA, I think is 70. What is the income, Howard? Is it $75,000?
No, it's higher than that.
I think a married couple filing jointly, it's over 100. I don't remember if it's 125. And then if you're single, I think it's under 100 if you're a single filer.
Something like that. So I guess that the trick is, can you make a viable car and still get the 7,500 and everyone make money? So
I think this is, again, Tesla led the way by putting LFP in Model 3s. And I that's my point to the US auto industry, is they probably need to capitulate on their high-end offerings, or the Ultimum, high nickel platform. But on the low end, they probably need to take a much harder look at LFP, which then gets into the carbonate and hydroxide.
But it also gets into the CATL is the main manufacturer of that, and there aren't really non-Chinese players in the LFP market, are there?
Yeah, and there's more of them now. I mean, Vivas Kumar just shipped his first sample from
that's still early stage.
Okay.
But
hey, Vivas, I love you, but okay, but let's look at it. Johnson Matthey was making it a long time ago, and then that Nano One owns that plant now. Admittedly, yes, it's not just CATL.
It was Ford CATL, that MOU, that MOU that's now on hold. That was meant to be, for their truck, whatever that, the E-Transit, right? Another thing that they were going to do in Mexico. I mean, that was a big thing for when Ford announced that.
Well, my counter to you would be, it's going to be simpler to transition to LFP outside of China than it is to build a bunch of lithium operations in the United States.
Okay.
And it's going to take some time. And you're absolutely right. CATL right now maybe has a bully pulp, but they're not the big cathode guy. I mean, there's, go back to the Pulids and, my buddy Yuan Gao, who used to run that. But yeah, fair point.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. They're going to have to. There's going to be a lot of. I guess the point is, raw materials is a difficult cost to get around, but they're going to have to find every and any efficiency to stay competitive and make EVs fairly priced if prices are going to be where we think they are.
Joe, you've rightly said, I think we believe in the selling fear, of China is definitely, battery arms race and all of that stuff. We've added our voice, to that. But fundamentally, the Achilles heel, go along with China's short, right? Go along with Tesla's short, and they're short raw materials, right? So is it fair to say that Chinese raw material domestic production, both brine and hard rock, will almost always be a rounding error in global supply, especially for the tier 1 battery?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that. I mean, I've been going to Shanghai since 2002. They spent literally billions of dollars, and they announced 20 years ago that next year they'd have 50,000 tons of high quality carbonate. And now, after billions of dollars in 20 years, they got about 50,000 tons of marginal quality carbonate that's seasonal. And then you add in, I've been up in Sichuan province at almost 4,000 meters, and the underground spodumene mine, they just don't have good resources. So I believe that China has just in lithium, not in the other metals, China has the greatest vulnerability, and they're not going to be able to start a lithium war because they're going to lose it quick, because most of the Europeans who would like to do conversion, I don't know when they'll ever sort that out, but admittedly there's a desire there. But in the US, Australia is a friendly, and a lot of spodumene could come to Elon's quote unquote refinery in the Gulf Coast of Texas.
I want to talk about that. Joe's industry expertise in living in China, et cetera, like on China related questions, I defer to your, expertise, but Roddy, do you have any thought as well?
Yeah, I mean, that was the question that I raised is will China get out of it? I think there's a number of issues and reasons on top of simply poor quality resource that's going to make it problematic for them. And in the end, and Joe's had lots of guys on his podcast, qualification and quality standards keep improving. So if your resources, if you're looking at more and more marginal against a requirement that's getting more and more stringent, good things aren't coming. That's the reality.
Well, Rodney, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, you wrap the ESG concerns in with this, and it becomes a toxic mixture for the globalization of selling Chinese EVs. Because a lot of people aren't, if you don't have a CV that you can show where your battery material came from and that it meets certain criteria, I mean, they can get sold in China, but
I agree, and I think that's the shakeout, Joe, and it'll come my way this end of town and elsewhere in third world markets. They will ship out, and they do already in their cars. Yeah. But in the major the European and US auto markets and some of the others, North America and so on, it's going to be an uphill struggle. And there's also other issues of jobs and all sorts of things. So aside from that, it's, I still think there's going to be some difficulties in actually meeting standards, to qualify into the decent vehicles. And that's, if you look at the average price of a new vehicle in the US and elsewhere, it's nearly triple what it is in China. People buy much more up-end cars, and the standard requirement is higher.
I want to go into the point you just made, Joe, about, Pilbara or others from Western Australia into Texas, or maybe it's Louisiana. I mean, those are two places that Elon Musk talked about, but Piedmont just announced something in Tennessee. So, and that could come from East Coast ports, it could come from Southeast ports, and then barged, up, into Tennessee. In Piedmont's case, they're planning to import from Ghana spodumene. But when I spoke to Pilbara, when we spoke to Dale Henderson, we asked him, long term about that, and he said, like, as a short-term solution, shipping spodumene could work, but it's not an effective carrier long term because there's so much waste. And he believes that, an intermediate product, lithium phosphate or lithium sulfate, that they hope with Calyx. So what do you think about that long term? Are we going to be shipping spodumene not just to China, but, to America and other places, or does it have to be some intermediate?
Well, obviously the intermediate's the favored path, and it's a better situation for the guys in WA if they can do that. They'll capture more value. I mean, the real win for all these producers in WA is ultimately how they participate further downstream, and obviously that's been part of Ken's mantra. It's now part of Dale's mantra. I think desperate times call for desperate measures sometimes. So if the U.S. had to rely on spodumene for a series of years, they would do so if there wasn't a better opportunity. I mean, how fast will Canada ramp up spodumene production? So I think it's there's a lot of nested variables in that whole question, but I totally agree with what Dale told you guys. I mean, I think that's where they're going in terms of shipping a lot less product, getting a higher value, less capital required on the other end with the customer. Yeah, that's obviously the better situation.
Well, AMG in Brazil is making a technical grade carbonate and shipping that to their hydroxide plant in Germany. But in Germany, you can't, there's just no place for the waste, right? If you're not mining it. So I think they have to do that. But Pilbara is shipping rock to Korea, with the POS LX process. That's not an upgraded product. And then you have, this debate, Piedmont's using the Metsu Outotec, Critical Elements is using that, Calibre is using that. Tesla didn't say that they're using that specifically, but they did say it's a sulfate-free process. Other companies are not using that. I don't think Albemarle is using that, or Tangshi, in Western Australia. So what are your thoughts, I guess, on if you're using a Metsu Outotec process? As I understand, the waste is less.
I would classify that. I would classify that as DLE-ish in that who's doing it on a large scale commercially right now?
No one yet. I mean, but whatever. Sabine and Calibre are going to be using it, and that's an initial scale. Critical Elements and others have not. Your friends, your Russian friends at Holmec, we're supposed to have a big deal in Russia. I'm assuming that's on hold now, but yeah, no one's doing that at scale.
Never bet against Pavel. That's my advice to you.
I spoke to, by the way, I forget the guy who the chief operating officer of Sigma,
Brian.
Yeah, to him at the Sigma event, and he talked positively about Metsu Outotec for whatever that's worth. Yeah, again, that's not an intermediate product. Like I said, what's a short-term and medium-term solution, to have conversion? Because there's a lot of where Sigma could sell their product not just to China. Right now, they can only sell it to China, but if they were to want alternative markets for that, I don't know that they're planning to upgrade that to a sulfate or some other. It's not been in their business plan. 2
European companies would sign a contract with Sigma tomorrow for spodumene.
Yeah, like Northvolt and La Vista and whatever, the Aurora.
Yeah,
all of those groups.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that. I don't see that as Sigma needs to start making spodumene concentrate, get their legs going with that, and then they can look at alternatives.
If you're Sigma, why would you cut a deal with a startup as a counterparty that's never done this before? Compared to selling it to a known quantity at $7,000 price. I think I see Sigma having significant negotiating leverage in that regard.
They Anna and Calvin are going to do what they're going to do, and I think they'll probably make a decision that makes sense for Sigma. I'm just saying that there are counterparties out there that are backing some of these guys that I guess that's about all I can say about that.
Okay. We covered kind of like hard rock to kind of Europe and the US. What about, South American brine to hydroxide refining, in Europe or US or, ex-China, Asia, like Allchem, Naraha, and you talked a few times about like GM Livent. What do you think about that as and then there's also Chile is a free trade agreement country with the US, so that would fit, Inflation Reduction Act, but Argentina isn't. I don't know if that could change or what that'll mean, but just as your thoughts on that, Joe.
Yeah, I don't think the Argentine thing is going to be a barrier. I think it's a friendly, and whether they need to do some paperwork to sort that out, I don't know. But I've been talking about Carlos Galli's been on the podcast a couple of times. We talked about Argentina being the bridge to Europe if they were really serious. And you've heard producers like now Allchem, back then Galaxy, talking about making a non-battery grade product to ship out and to be upgraded somewhere else, and that could have been to another product in Argentina, or it could have been to Europe as a feedstock. And I think that is a very viable strategy. And if I was Europe, just from an ESG perspective, I would certainly rather be dealing with less waste that a carbonate to hydroxide process would create than importing spodumene. I mean, I've talked about both because I think there aren't that many options, and you got to look at all of them. But carbonate, it's just a matter of the economics don't work for a converter at the prices we have right now.
Right. Okay, do you have any thought on that? Rodney is had load shedding in South Africa, so he got disconnected, and now his background's a little bit different. And Joe had the opportunity to
he's
find
still
his
as handsome as ever.
There you go. Just in the dark a little. Yeah, I mean, I think Joe summed it up there. I think there's also, from the European perspective, I mean, essentially what Joe's saying, and we understand that, is there are limitations to what is on offer on the continent. It's not North America. So you have to look at it slightly differently, and sometimes beggars can't be choosers. You've got to go with what's on offer. It'll be interesting to see if morals versus, it's a bit like now with the power and gas and whatever, if morals supersede cost.
Okay.
Well said.
So last question in this segment before we move to corporate activity, what you labeled over the years the drama in the Atacama, Joe. We taking a page from that, but using our pop culture references. I used to call it, the big chili, following my University of Michigan alumni status. And forgive me, like Michigan lost to Georgia, in the national championships. We didn't have that battle,
and they may again.
I was very disappointed with it. Was a huge surprise season for me to even get that far. But anyway, thoughts on SQM's Investor Day, and then I'm writing here the 2030. People talk about mine life, as important. Salar de Atacama is gigantic, but SQM as a company has a 2030 mine death, unless they renegotiate their contract with their public partner. So what do you think about what they said, in the Solar Futuro, and just broadly, thoughts on what you heard in Investor Day last week? I was there in New York with them. I have my own opinions, but curious yours and Rodney, having read and listened to that.
I did an interview last night with a Chilean newspaper with almost exactly those questions. And the article's supposed to come out in the next 48 hours. And the question really was, what did I think about SQM's future? And did I think it was the right thing for Corfo to continue with SQM? And, my opinion is it's absolutely in everybody's best interest for SQM and Corfo to extend the agreement, to have peace in the valley. And obviously Corfo now, I mean, I think you probably have the number. I think you quoted it yesterday, the amount of royalty income coming in now. I mean, it's in everybody's best interest to maintain lithium stability in the Atacama. And I don't think playing chicken to 2030 is the right strategy to be employed. I think SQM is trying to paint a humbler and greener picture of themselves. Admittedly hard to do, but at least they're trying to do that. I'm publicly stated, I was friends with the prior CEO. I am not friends with the current CEO, but that doesn't really matter. I am an investor in SQM, have been for a long time, and I hope they come to agreement. I think there's huge egos on both sides of this, and you have what's going on in the background politically in Chile that also makes it stressful. But there was a point of light with the constitutional vote, and things are still up for grabs. So yeah, I think SQM can and should continue. People may be surprised at me saying that, but I think it's just pragmatism.
And their DLE, and desalination plant discourse, like the CapEx that they put out there as perspective, it's still early days, but is much more meaningful than they had the unbelievably low capital intensity to grow from 50 to 150,000 tons. This will be meaningfully more expensive, but they've got to be more sustainable, right? It's all it's going to be a long negotiation here, but they threw out that carrot. We won't make these investments unless you extend, and it'll be interesting to kind of watch. But what did you think about, because the DLE aspect of it has gotten a lot of attention as well.
As I said, there are big egos on both sides, and there, SQM's never been a easy to get along with company. I mean, Felipe Smith is a great face for the company. Everybody loves Felipe, but SQM as an entity is pretty much a my way or the highway negotiator, even with customers. And I know that from years of experience. Be that as it may, there's just too much at stake here. And I think on DLE, I don't think they have anything right now but talk. And I think they are scrambling. And I can't really say any more than that.
Okay. Rodney, your thoughts on the Investor Day?
I mean, look, we have to give credit to the rate at which SQM has ramped up. It's been impressive. There's no doubt about it. They've matched or exceeded my forecasts, and that's the first time in a while. So they're certainly doing their bit from a revenue perspective, and paying their royalties. I agree with Joe on the DLE and the outside of it, but they've done a good job, and they've rejigged it. They're well exposed now to near-term pricing and the upside. I think there's a bit of confusion in the market and understanding what SQM gets versus what the spot in China is, because there's VAT and freight costs and all sorts of things. So it's always going to be skewed to lower. So they're actually doing, better than I think than people think. In a market like this, below battery grade is still going to get very good prices. I remember Joe making this point the last time, when the market was tight, there was a difference, but when it was oversupplied, but when it's tight, the differential, people are desperate for materials, so they get paid top dollars. In a tight market, they're always going to look good. They've ramped volumes well. They're keeping their costs reasonable. They're paying at these prices good royalties, but it seems it would make sense to have the devil, with some oversight, and they seem to be kept in check. If things have gone out of kilter, they've had requirements to bring them back into line. And the truth is, fresh water usage, I mean, the guys know the asset well, and they don't use as much as others. So I think from a Chilean perspective, the revenue is good, regardless of the emotional sentiment around it. And I think how they've done. I mean, their expansion has been impressive, to my mind.
I hope the Chilean state brings back Eduardo Bertrand to help further negotiate over the next kind of couple of years, because he did a great job.
I think he should be on SQM's board.
I saw a quote I read. He was hoping, like, they, over the life of that contract to 2030, I think he was hoping in 2018 that it would bring $8 billion over the whole period. And I don't know what the numbers were, but they were in the multi-billions already in the first half of this year. So hats off to him for helping the Chilean people to some extent, to SQM and the company and shareholders' expense. But anyway, it's the balance of the public-private partnership